Necessary now. So you see my guy.
Mimi sasa nini
You can get a nigga Chanel like in the store if you want it. I gave him the drill, they said they never got him on it. I bought a new bag, I might have to tone it. Taking these drugs up on me even to the morning. Take you to my
That's straight class.
nasumbua. Grace. Hah? Mau nggak jadi menjadi bersatuan?
So they're ready. Saya hello. It's okay. Yeah? Okay. Good morning, class. Yeah. So welcome to this lesson. KUC 214. So I hope everybody is set for this particular lesson. So you remember last week we discussed about the failed state in Somalia. So and we were able to acknowledge that Somalia is a complete failed state based on different reasons. Now, so having looked at that, we cannot really fully explain or argue that Somali is completely failed because with some negotiations and intervention by different stakeholders, we believe that Somalia will be okay one time. Now, so the next episode we need to discuss about is, as you look at Somalia, it's really a failed state. But actually, we need to underscore what actually went wrong in Africa. So this is something we need to discuss. We need to understand why Africa is actually bedeviled with a lot of challenges. What went wrong in Africa? Now, so to begin, so this is one of the hardest questions we need to interrogate. The hard question one needs to ask is, what actually went wrong in Africa? What really went wrong in Africa? Because after independence, I thought Africa was actually to enjoy some of the goodies of the independence, but something went wrong. Now, because looking at this, so people in colonies agreed to unite to free themselves, and they indeed became free. So because if you look at the African continent, basically, a good majority of these countries are independent. They are completely independent. But something is amiss. Now, look for example, the situation in contemporary Africa, the problem of drought, the crisis of food insecurity. Now, so the question is, what really went wrong? What is the main problem? Because sometimes we tend to question some of the basics. I mean, some of the issues that have bedeviled the African society. And when the colonial masters were in Africa, they put in place policies and laws which applied to the colonized Africans. And if you look at the laws that they made, some of these laws were so oppressive. So that's why we have, have that legacy of the colonial masters' doctrines that have indoctrinated the African society, because we thought Africa could be very independent, but we have a very big problem now, because if you look at most of the African countries, you remember recently in Guinea-Bissau, there was a coup d'etat. So the question is, Is the problem the leadership? So those are some of the issues that we need to interrogate. You know, if you look at some of these laws and policies that were actually brought about by the colonial masters, especially to do with economical, political, and social in outlook, were some of the punitive measures undertaken by the colonial masters to compromise with the with the post-colonial African society. Like a very good instance is the policy on land and exploitation. You know, when Europeans came, they alienated a lot of land. Now, rendering Africans landless, because if you look at most of the Africans, they were subjected to very unpotential areas, especially the swamps and so forth. And then the Europeans now took the best lands, which in case of Kenya became with what we call the White Islands. Now, so we have this example that denied the African opportunity to accumulate wealth, as Africans only work for the benefit of the Europeans. So if you look at Europeans in Africa, their main interest basically was what we call economic consideration. So their strategic placement in Africa was to exploit the resources. That is why Africa remained poor. And that is why if you look at the contemporary Africa, look at the problems that bedevil the African society, ranging from the political, social, and economic. So these are some of the issues we need to interrogate as scholars. Now, because if you look at, you know, materials, most of the raw materials in Africa, especially the raw materials, were exported to Europe. And then it was brought back to Africa in form of what we call the manufactured goods. And the bitter part of the story is that most of these goods were exorbitant in terms of pricing. So the question is, who is actually causing the crisis in Africa? Is it us who release the resources? Is it because of the coercion by the European powers? So those are some of the issues that we need to interrogate at this juncture. So that if you look at the African, basically, you know, we live hand to mouth. Because look at the budgeting in the contemporary African society. Every time governments read the budget, they normally read the budgets which are not sufficient to meet the needs of the society. They normally anchor their premise on borrowing. That, for example, a government can make a budget of 3 trillion, and what they can only afford is only 2 trillion. Now, the question is, how do you meet the threshold of the excess? So that is the problem. So we now tend to rely on the European powers to sort out our economic problem. Now, if you look at Africans politically, they have no voice, as they had no political organization to champion their interests. So that is the main problem, because Africans were coerced. They were not allowed to have organizations. They were not allowed to have parties. They were not allowed to form any political parties. And that is why it explains why Africa has actually remained a very poor continent. Africans were just but rendered what we call the subjects of the colonial master without economic or political rights. So that is why, you know, the events that unfolded during the colonial era has actually been, you know, pushed to the post-colonial independent Africa, because whatever happened during the colonial period is what is manifested in the pre-colonial, in the post-colonial African societies. Now, so if you look at African socially, they normally attend freely. You know, in terms of religion, Africa actually is believed, not even believe, but by looking at the way things are happening, you know, Africans are so religious. And this religiosity is actually attributed to the onset of missionaries in Africa, because when they came to Africa, they only gave us one very important thing, that we need not to put our resources on earth. That the Bible was very clear that we put our resources in heaven where no moths can reach. And that is why Africans tend to have that very strong belief that the only way out to a better life is to be so religious. So we have what we call religious fanaticism in Africa because of the belief that this is the only way out to salvage Africa from challenges. So that is why, if you look at organizations of labor in Africa, workers tried to fight colonial oppressive policies, because when Europeans came to Africa, they actually introduced what we call the labor policies, where they, you know, we discussed some time back that they introduced things like the Kibanda system, they introduced taxes, either hard tax or poll tax. This was a way to ensure that Africans provide labor on European farms. Now, so that, ladies and gentlemen, if you look at the African societies in the colony, they develop a sense of unity expressed in the Mau Mau. Now, so if you look at the Africans in Kenya, for example, you know, because of this oppressive nature, like for example, if you look at some of the communities, especially in central Kenya, where they were subjected to what we call the concentration camps, they really suffered a great deal. And that is why it has shared in a new political dispensation where communities now form what we call organizations. Like we had the Mau Mau organization, we had the Yanka Virondo, we had the Maasai Fraud organization, and so forth and so forth. So all these organizations were actually formed of actually fighting the colonial master, that is the British in Kenya. Now, so ladies and gentlemen, in case of Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, the colonizer was one, that was British. And for example, if you look at the African continent, we had the French, we had the Italians, we had the Portuguese, the Spaniards. All these colonies actually participated in the exploitation of the African resources. That's why, if you look at Africa, we are so poor. You know, we are only left with one thing. And the only option is now, you know, relying upon religious attributes to address the menace that is actually medieval in Africa. But you know, the question is, what really went wrong? What really went wrong? Is the problem the environment? Is the problem the colonial master? Is the problem our leadership? So I believe our leaders have really let us down. Because if you look at leaders, any potential leader ascending to power is actually it's like you know, you are actually launching corrupt deals, because corruption is actually bedeviled this very good African society. That is why people are so poor. Our poverty is not because we are lazy. Our poverty is addressed to the problem that are advanced by our leadership. So the question is, what do we do? How do we rectify these anomalies? Now, so if you look at the Mau Mau, for example, the Mau Mau fighters say that the white man should go home so that Africans would get independence. Why? Because they were looking at the prospects of enjoying the fruits of independence once the exploiters had gone. Now, so the issue of actually ensuring that the colonial masters were done away in Africa was actually to have the control over our own resources. Like, for example, the Mau Mau was a very vibrant association in Kenya, and they did that. And many communities also formed their own organizations. They formed their own associations. They formed their own political parties. And that's why, through this pressure mounted on the colonial masters, they were able to leave Africa, and particularly in Kenya. So Africans now basically were looking at all those infrastructures. We talk of infrastructures, we are talking about the roads, we are talking about the railways, we are talking about government buildings, which nationalists hope to exploit after independence, not for personal gain, but for national development. But the question is, who actually control most of this massive development that were advanced by the colonial master? So we tend to blame our governments. Like, for example, in Kenya, when Kenyatta took over power, so Kenyatta ensured that the resources were skewedly distributed in Kenya. So there was no issue of, there were no measures put in place on how to address the problem of Mau Mau. And that is why we have had what we call land injustices because of the misappropriation of the resources that were meant to address and given to these particular fighters. So that, ladies and gentlemen, looking at all these situations, so the independent leaders talked of nation building, social, economic development, once independence was achieved. But the question is, what went wrong? What went wrong? Because we were expecting to inherit a very strong economic base in Africa. Africa's land actually harbors a lot of resources. Look at a place like Congo, where it has all the minerals that are found in the world. But the problem in Congo is so perennial. The problem is so persistent. Why? Because of the selfish nature of our leaders. We had the likes of people like Mobutu Sese Seko. We had leaders like Pakili Muluzi of Malawi. We had leaders like Idi Amin of Uganda, and so many others. Why? Because they were not interested in developing Africa. Their interest was so egoistic because they wanted to fulfill their own ambitions. Now, so if you look at Africa, we talk so much about democracy. We talk so much about the regional cooperation for the good of the people. Now, so when you talk of democracy, I believe, and everybody understand, that democracy is what is referred to as the government of the people, for the people, by the people. But the question is Africa democratic? Look at the scenario of Congo, where it is referred to as DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. This is an abuse, because democracy is an all-inclusive government. You go to a scenario, a place like Congo, where you have all the militia controlling Congo, where we have the M23, we have the Banyamulenge, we have the government. Now, so the question is, how do we develop? So development means you call upon all the stakeholders to come together so that they can be able to, put all their efforts together to ensure that there is development. Now, so if you look at the case of Kenya, for example, Europeans took the best lands in what we call the White Islands, and Africans were subjected to poor lands. They put up schools. They build very excellent roads, put up railways in what we call Atlantic railway lines. But the problem is, so what happened? Because we inherited all this property, we inherited all these economic, social, and social endeavors. The problem is what happened. So that's why I still pose the question: what really went wrong in Africa? What went wrong in Africa? So that above all, Africans grew and supply all kinds of crops, but to work on European farms. Now, so if you look at land alienation in Africa, Africans were only allowed to occupy limited pieces of land. And they were also controlled, in terms of investment, like keeping animals. They were not allowed to keep more than 5 heads of animals. They were not allowed to have more than 2 acres of land. They were not allowed to grow crops for export or economic purposes. They were only allowed to grow crops for subsistence farm, subsistence. That is little for little for disposal and little for consumption. So that's why Africa lived hand to mouth, and the same scenario is now experienced because we are living hand to mouth. As we are talking now, we are dealing with a very serious crisis. You remember in 1928 to 30s, we had what we call international economic depression. And the same depression now is felt in Africa. So that our African leaders now tend to apportion blame to the international players. They look at the international communities as one way of actually causing this menace in Africa. So that's the question we need to interrogate. So it is believed that the fight for independence would give all the resources to Africans. And since they had been developing Europe, the situation would be reversed as soon as independence was acquired. But what really went wrong? So that is the kind of a question we need to interrogate. It is so painful. It is so unwarranted. It is so inhuman. For someone to die, not because of any pandemics, but because of anger. So I really don't blame Europe for the problems we deal in Africa. I purely and squarely put blame on African leaders. We have animalistic leaders. I call them monsters because they don't allow people to develop. Now, so the subjects were going to become masters. So most of those who control Africa are now controlling. So the so-called the African leaders are now trying to control the Africans and subjecting the same Africans to dehumanizing situations because we live with poverty. Poverty is part and parcel of us. So the question is, what are we supposed to do as an African society? So we need to interrogate some of these issues. So that we allow Africa to enjoy. We need to live a better life, not a dehumanizing life. So, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to say that the situation in Africa is a bit challenging. Now, let me pose a question. Now, according to your own observation, are we really moving in the right direction? Are we really moving in the right direction? Can somebody respond to this question and give us an input? Anybody? Hello? Anybody? Anyway, so in as far as I'm concerned, I used to say that yeah. Now, looking at this, as soon as independence came to Africa, African leaders took over reins of power. And as soon as, no sooner did they ascended to power, they forget that we need to be addressed. Our problems need to be addressed. So we need to provide Africa with the solution. And the solution lies squarely on our leaders. Now, so we have this problem of, nepotism. People ascend to power. They actually look at the power and looking at their own closer people, close relatives, employ their relatives. Say that now power only surrounds within. So that's why, if you look at Africa, we have a big problem. Look at a very good example of Uganda, where Uganda is only controlled by one family, that is the Museveni's family. Okay. So Museveni's family has actually controlled the entire Ugandan society. So, and that is why I want us to actually come out of this particular situation. So, ladies and gentlemen, nationalists wanted to remove this suffering in Africa by ensuring that they rid of the white man who was exploiting their resources. But my question is, was it necessary to make these Europeans to go away from Africa? Was it necessary? Because we still are faced by a lot of challenges in Africa. Because when you look at Africa, Africa has remained undeveloped for too long. Africa has remained with perennial problems. Now, so who is now to salvage this continent? The subjects were to become the masters, which is now the opposite. So that is why, as soon as independence in Africa came, African leaders took over. So when they took over these governments, they were actually not ready to ensure that these governments were given the mandate to improve the welfare of the society. So this is the tragedy of the highest order in Africa. Now, because the spirit of Africanism, the spirit of unity, the spirit of nationalism, which were actually supposed to salvage Africa from this particular problem, is not manifested in the contemporary African society. So that is why, ladies and gentlemen, leaders now began to control they forgot that this was no longer possible after British destroyed the pre-colonial nations and societies together, and this actually became a precedent for the fall of African societies. So never forget that we are trying to address the problem of the missing link in African society. So that's the question we need to interrogate. Now, bearing this in mind, the people who are perceived to serve the entire country were now being only confined to serving their own tribal cocoons. So nepotism became critical in Africa. Ethnicity became the apex, reaching the apex in Africa, because we no longer serve the interest of nationalism, where we bring the unity to entire communities in Africa. Resources which were rescued from the colonizer were shared by those who spoke the same language with those in power. Now, because if you look at most of the leaders in power, they only apportion land to people who are well connected, either by relation. And that is why we still remain very poor in Africa. As we talk now, we've got a lot of people in the society who are landless. So this landlessness is actually the question of those who are in power. So what are we supposed to do? Now the problem sometimes is we tend to question and try to interrogate who actually is the cause of this problem, because we are electing them. So we elect the thieves, we elect the corrupt leaders because they have the resources. So unless we now come to senses that we need to elect leaders who are visionary. That's why if you look at the scenario of Kenya, most of those who have been put in power are just in power because they had resources. And that's why they compromise with the development of the nation as a whole. So with tribalism, nepotism, corruption, resource distribution has never been fair. You remember after the post-election violence in Kenya, so Krikla came up with some good agendas, and one of the most critical agenda was addressing the land issue. We had a commission which was actually led by Dungu in what we call Dungu report. It has never been revealed so that it is able to address the problem of land question in Kenya. So that if you look at people from one ethnic group, they use their positions in government to gain the lion's share of the nation's resources. That is why, if you look at the power, whenever one ascends to power, the community feels that it is their time to eat. Now, what happens to those marginalized communities? When will they ever get a chance to lead? So that's the question we need to interrogate, and we need to provide a solution to it. So, ladies and gentlemen, it was indeed unfair distribution of resources which kill the spirit of nationalism in Africa. And that is why fighting in Africa is inevitable. So there is need for a revolution. There is need for a serious change. There is need for societies to come together and address the question of unfair distribution of resources. So thus, the love of one's country stopped making sense. Because I remember at one time, the government of Kenya was actually pursuing the issue of najivunia kuwa Mkenya. That was one of the biggest scenarios that we experienced in Kenya. Now, my question was, because I remember one time when Mutua was the spokesman for government, So we met one time when he came to us in KUC County. I confronted him as he was actually doing the rounds on tunajifunia kuwa Mkenya. I questioned him, when did we cease to be Kenyans? Why this mission? So he told us that people have lost the sense of patriotism. So the question is, why should some people be eating more than enough while others are sleeping hungry? It is simply because of their ethnic origin. So there was a time in power, you go to government offices, you need to identify yourself not by who you are, because the mention of your noun actually places you or actually raises a lot of eyebrows. That is why if you look at a country like Tanzania, for example, so ladies and gentlemen, yeah, sorry for that very commercial break. Now, so there was so there was this question of why we don't have that love for our nation. Now, the problem and the question and the answer lies on what you call, inequality in terms of resource distribution. And this made people to want to steal and carrying other means of revenge. Now, basically, when you look at Africa, we have had the problem of, the problem of resource distribution. Now, so sometimes you question why should one consolidate all the resources in Kenya at the expense of the majority who are poor? If you look at the scenario, especially during the, in situations like northeastern part of Kenya, look at Turkana, look at countries like Mali, look at Somalia, look at Sudan, and most of these countries. Why do people die? Why? Is the problem nature? Do we blame our God in Africa? Or is the question of gods must be crazy in Africa? So these are some of the issues that we need to interrogate. And that's why we shall remain poor up to a period when we come to census. So we have those who are managing our resources. We have the accountants who steal public resources. Because if you look at those actually who are dealing with the issues of our accounts in Kenya, this is where our resources are looted. Now, sometimes I question if our managers, if our accountants are the ones stealing money from the government, what is the need of empowering people to pursue some of these causes? Though we cannot blame everybody, that the looting is only done by managers. The looting is not only done by accountants. We have the procurement systems in Kenya. You know, it is so unfortunate because, you know, you look at how the procurement policies are put in place. If I am to procure a cup, which in the normal circumstances is worth around 50 shillings, but in the procurement, the same cup will go for 500 shillings. The question is, what is wrong? What is wrong? You remember at one time when the NYS, the monumental scandal ever in Kenya, where a pyro pen, which is worth only 10 shillings, was being procured at around 200 shillings. I mean, 1,000 shillings. Then now the question is, what went wrong? Where are our senses? Are our leaders losing senses? Who will protect this African continent? What must we do? You know, sometimes you give up. Sometimes you feel like giving up living in Africa. And that is why we have had a lot of exodus of Africans going for greener pastures in the Middle East, majority to Australia, European countries. Why? Because life in Africa is becoming unbearable, because the looters who are actually doing the looting in the large scale are actually depriving Africa of the resources. Now, so this is actually what we call the social contract, where people elect their governments and it serves their interest. Now, so whenever we elect these leaders, we need to engage them. We need to have what we call a social contract. What is our engagement with these leaders? So that no sooner do we elect these leaders than they abandon us. I remember during the recent elections in Kenya, we participated so heavily in some of these elections. Our leaders used to receive the phones. You could call your leader and was able to take your phone call. But no sooner did they ascended to power than they changed their lines. We can no longer call them. We can no longer access them because they have achieved their ego. We now remain with only some 4 years. Then they also reservists now, and now, try to lure us to once again for them to power. That's the problem. People can only be interested in a government if they think the government is interested in them. And this only happens where there is democracy. But the question is, do we have democracy in Africa? If in Africa, the only monumental achievements is rigging of elections, so that people who have ability to lead are elected without cheating. Should we have such a period of time? Should we actually have such a scenario where we can elect leaders based on their qualifications? If you look at the appointments that are done in many governments, these appointments are so shooty because they elected people who don't meet the minimum threshold, and if so, they are also compromised because of the linkage of what we call tribalism and nepotism. But in absence of democracy, people get jobs because of who they are. We look for jobs. We have the qualification. Sometimes somebody was actually implying that, you know, having a document is not actually the way out in life. The only way out is the connection. So that if you look at those in power, their papers are questioned. And who are we to question them? Wameweka watu ambao hawana uchuzi. That's why we are in crisis. That's why we suffer. So when you actually try to interrogate what went wrong in Africa, it makes one so frustrated. Because no sooner did I began this discussion than I am now so devastated because of the level of the crises that are caused by our leaders. Because when you talk of employment, how many people are employed? Who are these people employed? We tarmac. We've got papers. We knock on offices. Nobody gives you an hearing. Nobody gives you an opportunity because the question is, who are you? And that is why if you look at Tanzania, for example, Mwalimu Nyerere welded and caused the fabric of the Tanzanians. Kwa sababu Mwalimu alisema kwamba, like in Tanzania, they have 162 ethnic groups. Mwalimu akasema kwamba iwapo tutakuwa tunakuza suala la ukabila, Mwalimu akasema ukabila ni utundu, ni ushenzi, ni utukutu, kusheheni masuala ya ukabila. Because in Tanzania, mtu anakuuliza jina na ana insist, anataka kujua jina la kinyumbani. So that if you hear the name by the surname, it is only the name that can make you get a job. That is the tragedy in Africa. Ethnicity, corruption, lack of patriotism, and those in power, some of them lack personnel. Now, so we have had people who have championed for nationalism, but the problem is they have been eliminated. Look at the likes of people like Tom Mboya, Steve Biko in South Africa, Jonas Savimbi, Angola. All of them were eliminated because they believed these were the obstacles to allow those in power to loot the resources. So anytime you raise the question of what is going wrong in Africa, and the answer is you have to be eliminated. So many people have lost their lives. We have buried men the country. Now, so if you look at leadership in Africa, so whenever a leader ascends to power, they look upon their ethnic group. So this ethnicity has become one of the most phenomenal crises in Africa. It's even more than Corona, more than Ebola. And that's why we suffer in Africa because of ethnic orientation, ethnic cocoonism. Now, so the question is, what went wrong in Africa? We got independence in Africa. We moved from one-party system to what we call multi-partyism, hoping that multi-partyism could provide us a way out in Africa. But it is all one game. And the game ends at who are you? It is not the amount of the knowledge that you've acquired. It is not the amount of the documents that one has. It is not the amount of the degrees and certificates that one has. It is the amount of the connection of the ethnic group that will make you to survive in Africa. In many parts of Africa, they have banned political parties, claiming that one-party system was good for development in the country. And the head of state could stay for power, could stay in power for too long. If you look at the scenario in Kenya, why Moi survived for 24 years is because he was protected by the multipartyism in Kenya. Look at the likes of Museveni. Museveni ruled Uganda from 1986 to date, and he seemed not even to show the sign of moving out of power. Now, the question is, what is the need of having a country? What is the need of even voting? That's the problem now. We have dictatorship in Africa. And you know, the worst tragedy that has befallen this continent is people taking all the monies to foreign countries. We have had a lot of investments in the foreign countries where we are now losing the resources. You remember the other day, they were talking about the Pandora Leaks, where somebody had more than 3 trillion abroad. The question is, whose benefit are these resources? But thank God there is a solution. And the solution lies with one thing. All these leaders at one time will be buried till dying. Look at the likes of Idi Amin. He thought he was to become immortal, but God decided to take him. So that's the only solution to sort out the problem of those leaders in power. And this explains why people are eliminated whenever they talk about national building. In Africa, one is not allowed to bring in positive issues that regards to development. Because no sooner do you introduce these very positive issues than you are eliminated. And that's why many people cannot speak out. We cannot speak out our minds because we are likely to be eliminated. Mtu atakwambia bwana unanisumbua. That's why I remember in Kenya at one time, one of the British ambassadors in Kenya was questioning some leaders in Africa. And the question was, ninyi mtakula mpaka mnachitapikia kwa viatu. You know, you loot so much that you can puke on your shoes. So, I mean, what will it benefit you if you are owning the entire country in Africa? If you are controlling the resources, the same way Mobutu was actually controlling all the resources in Congo, ranging from the central bank and all the minerals. He used to sleep on a bed made of gold. His children used to learn in Paris, France. They used to day school using the planes. Children are flown in the morning, they are back in the evening. Now the question is, where is Mobutu now? Where is Mobutu? So that's why we are warning these leaders that no matter what you do to derail development in Africa, it will one time come to an end. So that's why African leaders did not want opposition parties, because to them there were no two centers of power, especially in the pre-colonial African societies. Corruption. Look at the farmers who had no land, who had land, but could not get agricultural inputs like tractors, fertilizer, seeds for production. So that is the problem that we have in Africa. So ladies and gentlemen, the whole scenario in Africa, as we come to summary, is that even those who grew and supplied foodstuffs like maize, beans, peas, are also all government by money. So because if you look at the production, people are so productive in Africa, but the problem lies with marketing. The problem lies with pricing. Because, look at the scenario in Kenya. The input is more than the output, the output is more than the input. So that if you venture into farming, you are likely not to actually acquire and secure what you really wanted because of the compromised prices in the name of what you call liberalization. Now, who actually are the actors of this liberalization? We had a problem of fuel shortage in Kenya in the name of subsidy. And if you look at some few oil pumps in Kenya who are owned by certain individuals who control power. Na wauliza hii mali mtachukua wapi? So professionals end up going to work outside their countries. That is why we have lost what we call the brain drain. Because if I am assured of a lucrative job in Europe, why should I sit in Africa? That is why most people are now moving out of Africa. Tuachia hawa kule, so that by the time tukirudi watakuwa wametabika. What is wrong in Africa? Education was well developed in the colonial period, and it was not spared the problem of poor leadership. Now, I am looking at this program called CPC. Now, to me, CPC is a good, it's a very good education system. But let me ask you a question. How many leaders in Kenya have taken their kids to study this program called CPC? If you look at these most prominent schools who take international programs like ICE and so many other programs, why are these leaders taking their children to these prominent and very magnificent curriculums and leaving us with the CPC? CPC is only a program for the poor. I'm sorry to say that. And that is why if you question some of these leaders, you can be eliminated. So, but it is better to die than to see things fall apart. So that's why, if you look at the education system in Africa, it is not actually the education that is for the benefit of the society. So that's why we need to address some of these issues. In some cases, nationalist intellectuals were arrested, some killed, and the rest forced to exile. You remember we have the likes of people like Ngukiwa Thiong'o, a whole professor, because of politics. We had the likes of people like Chinua Achebe in Nigeria. He was deported abroad because of political stand. Now, the question is, what are we supposed to do? We have the likes of Miguna in Kenya, who is not allowed to live in Kenya, his motherland, just because of controversies surrounding his life. So with men and women close to power, in control of education institutions, many intellectuals who did not toe the line were chased out or closed out if they were coming back. So we cannot actually sometimes, like when we have these appointments to different positions in Kenya, the question is, who are you? Are you connected well? So sometimes you question, why do people struggle with all these documents? Somebody enrolling for a certificate, you move to the degree, move to master's, you move to doctorate, you become a professor, but you are not enjoying the fruits of your labor. Yet we have those in power who have no papers, but they control the systems in Kenya. They control the systems in Africa. Illiteracy. Those in power, majority of them are illiterate, but they control and marshal power. So the question is, why education? Why? Now, intellectuals now are just but making noise. They are just noisemakers who had no respectfully elders. Most of the leaders just wanted to behave like village chiefs. They want to control everything. These leaders, what mattered was loyalty to the government, and anybody who did not support the government, however bad it was, had to go. So we have had so many people who try to question the status quo of the government. And the only solution and the way out is two issues, either to be eliminated completely or you are not allowed to be around power. So that is the most critical problem that we have in Africa. So ladies and gentlemen, as we end up to wind up this particular discussion, it raises a lot of questions in Africa. Because in some cases, where the regime in power may be scared of being removed, there cannot be development as they think of how they would survive in exile, and it's the reason they bank money. So most of these leaders have taken money abroad. So no sooner do the new power comes in, that those in power exit, and they just don't move around, move away, but they move with resources. Now, so the money in circulation becomes a problem. So they stash their resources in abroad, like in Swiss bank and so forth. They also spend most of the money on survival, apart from banking money on foreign accounts. What are you benefiting your own country? They pay obscene salaries to their men and women to keep them in power. So that's the question we need to interrogate. In most cases, the people who are mistreated by the regime end up taking up the gun, and the result is civil war. When the rule of law fails, in normal circumstances, the rule of the jungle prevails. Because people have been over-throttled for too long, it is now time to rise up. And that is why we have a revolution in Africa. If you look at the scenario and the most concluded elections in Kenya, it was the question of a revolution where the whole power should not be top bottom, but it is bottom up, as it was espoused by the former US President Obama, who said that the economy should actually be bottom up. That is, the majority who are poor should be given an opportunity to control the resources, and that was what is the case in Kenya. As we summarize, the population of non-combatants will all go into exile and live in refugee camps. And the result of this is dependency on foreign food with no production and hence no development. So the question is, for how long are we supposed to vend for our survival in foreign powers? That's the biggest question. That is what happened in most African countries after independence, and that is why things fall apart in Africa. So we need now to rethink on how things should be brought together in Africa. So ladies and gentlemen, so I wish to say that I just end up there so that next week we shall be now able to embark on another topic. So thank you very much. Magdi. Yeah. Huh? So do I? So nina sign hapa.